The winter of 1985 came early to Detroit, Michigan. By the third week of November, Lake St. Clair had begun to freeze at its edges, and the wind that cut through the streets of the east side carried with it the kind of cold that didn't just chill the skin, it pressed itself against the bones and stayed there. It was on the 14th of that November, in the dim corridors of Detroit Receiving Hospital on St. Antoine Street, that a boy was born to a woman named Carol Merritt. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and already exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with labor. She named the boy John, plain, simple, without ceremony, and she held him for perhaps 20 minutes before the nurses took him to be cleaned and weighed. He was 6 pounds and 2 ounces. He had dark eyes that couldn't yet focus on anything, and small fists that grabbed at the air as though searching for something to hold. Carol lived in a rented room on Chalmers Avenue, a narrow street of tired houses where the gutters were always full and the street lights worked only half the time. She had come to Detroit 3 years earlier from a small town called Alpena, up in the northern part of Michigan, chasing something she couldn't quite name, opportunity perhaps, or simply distance from a family that had never been particularly kind to her. She worked at a laundromat on Harper Avenue, folding other people's clothes for 7 hours a day, 5 days a week, and the money she earned was just barely enough to keep the room, keep the lights on, and eat with modest regularity. A child had not been part of any plan she had ever made, but here he was, John, and she looked at him with an expression that was equal parts love and terror. His father was a man named Dennis, who had worked briefly at an auto parts warehouse, and who, by the time John was 6 weeks old, had relocated to Cleveland without leaving a forwarding address. Carol did not go looking for him. She simply adjusted, the way women in her position so often had to do, and she pressed on. John's earliest memories, the ones that would stay with him decades later, surfacing at odd, unwanted moments, were not of warmth or safety. They were of sound, mostly. The thin walls of the Chalmers Avenue room, through which he could hear the couple next door arguing with a consistency that made it feel like weather. The rattle of the radiator in winter. His mother's voice on the telephone, low and strained, speaking to someone who was clearly not pleased with her. He remembered the smell of cigarette smoke embedded in the carpet, and the way the ceiling in his bedroom had a water stain shaped vaguely like a hand reaching downward. He slept on a fold-out sofa that Carol kept made up for him in the corner. He was a quiet child, watchful, with the particular stillness of small people who have learned early that the world around them is unpredictable. He started school at Karstens Elementary on Ashland Street in September of 1990, and his teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Holloway, noted in her early assessments that John was bright, genuinely, uncommonly bright, but that he was reluctant to speak in class, that he often came to school in clothes that were slightly too small and sometimes slightly dirty, and that he ate his free school lunch with a speed and concentration that suggested it might be the most reliable meal of his day. Mrs. Holloway was the kind of teacher who noticed these things, and she was kind to him in small, quiet ways, a book left on his desk, an extra portion at lunch, a word of encouragement that he filed away and kept. He would think of her years later when he was lying on a piece of flattened cardboard in a doorway on a cold street, and he would wonder what she would think if she could see him now. He hoped she had retired. He hoped she didn't know.
He walked into the enrollment office of the Chicago Workforce Logistics Program on the 8th of November 2005, 6 days before the deadline, wearing his cleanest shirt and carrying that folded piece of paper as though it were a passport. The woman at the desk asked him his name. He told her. She typed it into the system, and just like that, something began. The program ran for 9 months, 3 evenings a week at a training center on West Diversity Avenue, plus weekend workshops once a month. John worked his warehouse night shifts 4 days a week to pay his rent and bills, slept for 5 or 6 hours, then took 2 buses to reach the training center by 6 in the evening. He did this through winter, through the bone-cracking cold of a Chicago January when the wind off Lake Michigan felt like it was trying to push him backward, through February when the buses ran late and his left hand ached so badly in the cold that he had to grip the handrail with his right. He did it through March, when he was so tired one evening that he fell asleep on the bus and missed his stop and had to walk 40 minutes back in the rain, arriving at class 25 minutes late and soaking wet, and still, sitting down, opening his notebook and picking up exactly where he had left off. Nobody gave him that. He earned every single minute of it. The course covered supply chain management, logistics software, procurement systems, inventory analytics, and transport coordination. Most of his classmates were younger, mid-30s, a few in their late 20s, and some of them had fragments of formal education he didn't have. But John had something they didn't have in quite the same measure. He had spent years watching systems operate at their most basic level, from the warehouse floor, from the loading dock, from the position of the man who actually does the physical work while someone else makes the decisions. He understood instinctively and practically where the inefficiencies were, where time and money hemorrhaged away invisibly, where the gap between how things were supposed to work and how they actually worked was widest. His instructors noticed this. One of them, a consultant named Harris, who had spent 20 years in freight logistics, told him after a class one evening that he had a structural mind, that he saw systems rather than tasks, and that this was not something you could teach. John graduated from the program in August of 2026. He was 41 years old. He was hired within 3 weeks by a mid-sized freight logistics firm based in the West Loop, a company called Meridian Freight Solutions, which operated a network of distribution contracts across the Midwest. He started as a logistics coordinator, earning $47,000 a year, which was more money than he had ever earned in his life, and which he treated with almost comical seriousness, budgeting every dollar, spending almost nothing on himself, building his savings account with the focused patience of a man who had learned, the hard way, exactly what it felt like to have nothing. He was good at the job. He was better than good. Within 8 months, he had reorganized the internal tracking protocol for 3 of Meridian's largest contracts, reducing delivery delays by 19%, a figure that appeared in a quarterly report and which his manager, a woman named Christine Adler, cited in a meeting with senior leadership. He was promoted to senior coordinator, then 14 months after that to operations manager. His salary climbed to $68,000, then to $81,000. He moved to a better apartment, still in Rogers Park, still modest, but larger, with proper light, and a kitchen he actually cooked in, and he bought a desk and put it by the window, and in the evenings he sat at it and read, not just for pleasure now, but with purpose, studying industry reports, following freight market trends, learning the language of the business at every level.
He saved. He saved with extraordinary discipline. He contributed the maximum to his retirement account. He opened investment accounts and learned, slowly, carefully, with the same methodical patience he applied to everything, how markets worked, how compound growth worked, how money, properly managed, did not simply sit still, but moved, accumulated, built upon itself. He was not reckless. He was never reckless. He had seen what recklessness cost. In 2030, aged 44, he left Meridian, not because he was unhappy, but because he had seen, clearly and with increasing certainty over the preceding year, a gap in the market that nobody was adequately filling. There was in the Midwest freight network a profound inefficiency in the coordination between small and medium-sized warehouses and the last-mile delivery operations serving them. Large logistics firms weren't interested in clients below a certain contract value. Smaller operators lacked the technology and the management capacity to serve those clients reliably. John had spent 4 years watching this gap cost businesses money and time, and he knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent his life reading situations accurately, that he could fill it. He registered a company. He called it Clear Path Logistics. He incorporated it in Illinois with $12,000 of his own savings, worked from his apartment desk for the first 6 months, and secured his first 3 clients through relationships he had built at Meridian, businesses that trusted him personally, that had worked with him, that knew his word was worth something. He managed their logistics contracts himself, using software systems he had learned and in some cases modified to suit his specific approach, and he delivered results that were measurably better than what his clients had experienced before. The first year was the hardest thing he had ever done, and he had done very hard things. There were months when he wasn't certain he could make payroll for the one part-time assistant he had hired, a young woman named Danny, who was still in college and worked remotely, and who turned out to be absolutely exceptional. There were months when a contract fell through or a client delayed payment, and John sat at his desk at 2 in the morning doing the maths again for the 4th or 5th time, trying to find room he had already found wasn't there. He didn't sleep properly for most of that year. He ate simply, spent nothing unnecessary, carried the anxiety of it with him every waking hour. But he did not stop. By the end of year 2, ClearPath had 12 clients and a small team of 4 full-time employees. By year 3, they had expanded into Ohio and Indiana. John hired an operations director, a sales lead, and a technology manager who rebuilt their internal systems from the ground up. Revenue in year 3 exceeded $2 million. In year 4, it exceeded $5 million. He reinvested aggressively, expanded carefully, maintained the culture of the company with the obsessive attention of someone who knew exactly what it looked like when an organization lost its integrity. He had worked for enough of them.
He did not forget where he had come from, not for a single day. He established a partnership with the same community center on Morse Avenue, where he had attended Thursday evening groups, funding a mentorship initiative for people coming out of homelessness who were interested in employment and entrepreneurship. He hired from that community, deliberately and consistently, because he knew what it meant to be given a genuine opportunity by someone who didn't have to give it. He remembered Sandra Park. He remembered Marcus from Cincinnati. He remembered Mrs. Holloway and the book left quietly on a desk. By 2035, John Merritt was 50 years old. Clear Path Logistics operated in 7 states. It employed over 140 people. The company's annual revenue had crossed $18 million, and in the bank account of a man who had once spent 3 years sleeping rough across the cities of the American Midwest, a man who had eaten from bins, who had held his hands over heating vents in Chicago winters to keep his fingers from going numb, who had filled out 17 job applications in 6 months and received 17 rejections, there was a personal net balance approaching $20 million. He didn't buy a mansion. He bought a clean, well-furnished house in Evanston, just north of the city, with a garden and bookshelves that covered 2 walls and a desk by the window. He still woke early. He still read. He still walked along the lakefront sometimes in the mornings, watching the water move, remembering the bench in Loyola Park and the gray October sky and the folded piece of paper in his pocket. And here is what he would tell you if you asked him, and he would say it plainly, without drama, the way he said everything. The difference between the man on the bench and the man he became was not talent. He had always had the talent. It was not luck, though a few things broke his way at the right moment. It was not even intelligence, though he had that too. The difference was the decision to stand up from the bench and walk toward something, toward one small possible thing on one ordinary October afternoon when every reasonable assessment of his situation said that it was too late, that too much had gone wrong, that the distance between where he was and where he might be was simply too far to travel. It wasn't too late. It is never